Hello and welcome to the Arabic Hour. My name is Ghanwa Hakim. Today we'd like to welcome to our program Professor Amahl Bishara. Professor Bishara is both an assistant professor of anthropology at Tufts University and a Palestinian activist. At Tufts, Professor Bishara teaches and conducts research on media, the state, and human rights, particularly in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Among her publications include her book entitled Backstories, U.S. News Production and Palestinian Politics, which looks into the production of U.S. news in the West Bank during the Second Intifada. In addition, she directed a 2010 documentary entitled Degrees of Incarceration, which revolves around the topic of how a Palestinian community responds to the crisis of political imprisonment. Currently, Professor Bishara is working on a research project on popular politics in the Aida Refugee Camp, along with research on the relationship between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank. Today's interview with Professor Bishara revolves around the divisions of the Palestinian community and issues affecting the residents of the various communities there today. In addition, her interview includes details about her work and research in Palestine.
Thank you, Ghanwa. We're happy to welcome to our audience today Amahl Bishara. And Amahl, we're happy to see you today, and I hope we can have a good discussion about the Palestinians in Israel and beyond that.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, it's been a little time since we've had you, and so we need to get caught up. I think it would be interesting for our audience if you can tell us in a very brief way, who are the Palestinian citizens of Israel? Mostly because people, point to and say, well, you have citizens and they vote, and what are you complaining about Palestinians? So tell us who they are and how many of them there are.
So in 1948, as of course you know, about 750,000 Palestinians became refugees. They were pushed out of their homes and villages, and they weren't allowed to return home. About 150,000 Palestinians, between 100 and 150,000 Palestinians were able to stay inside the borders of what became Israel. That was
78% of Palestine at the time, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as they stayed on, from 1948 to 1966, most of those Palestinians were actually under Israeli military rule, very much like the Israeli military occupation that actually operates now in the West Bank and in a different way in Gaza. But I should really say that the occupation of Palestinians from 48 to 66 was a lot like the occupation of Palestinians from 1967 to 1994, because it was a direct Israeli military rule over those communities. After 1966, that Israeli military rule was lifted, and these Palestinians from the beginning had been in a really contradictory and difficult position. They did have Israeli citizenship, but for example, from until 1966, they needed movement passes.
To get from village to village, even. Right?
Exactly. Yes. The other time, last summer, I was in Palestine with my father, and we were in his village in Tashiha, which is a village in the Galilee inside Israel. And we were walking together down the street, and I said to him, "So, was this a kind of a place where you could be without a permit?" And it was about a 10-minute walk from his house, right on the edge of town. Could you be here without a permit? He said, "I could be on this side of the street, but not that side of the street." So the restrictions on movement were very, very stringent during that period.
Why do you think the Israelis gave them citizenship and now allow them to vote, and yet they restricted them? How do you explain this contradiction?
Well, I think that certain kinds of settler colonial projects, like Israel, that attempt to incorporate indigenous populations, right? They can't push everybody out. And so the second option then is to say incorporate them, turn them into a minority that has sort of less rights than the settler population, but enough rights to sort of accommodate them and keep them, acquiescent was I think the goal.
And also in her book, Shira Robinson points out the fact that they always did really not want Palestinians. They wanted a Jewish state, but they also were looking for credibility from the West. And in order to do that, they had to look kind and accepting of Palestinians. So there was this contradiction of eventually removing martial law in 1966. And then, and of course, they had citizenship, they could vote, but at the same time, they had been restricted during the period of martial law in particular, restricted to almost little ghettos. So one is a face to the West, and one is a face to their Zionism. And you're right, they had to look like they were incorporating. But tell us, beyond this period, we have the '67 war, and that's when
Actually, can I just go back and say something about this contradiction, right? I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, you know, Israel granted them citizenship and certain kinds of rights because it was a way to make Israel look more legitimate on the world stage. But often we see these kinds of rights that are given so that they're on paper and they can be made public in certain ways in news texts, and it makes Israel look like a normal state. But what one needs to do really is to look at the everyday lived experiences of politics. Right. So, for example, the movement passes. The fact that there was an incredible, you know, people were incorporated into the legal system. They were arrested in huge numbers, Palestinians, during that period, right, for the minorest of infractions, right? So there are all of these ways in which the Palestinian population inside Israel was being criminalized, marginalized, pushed further into poverty. They'd been in many cases, dispossessed of their land. So all of these problems that happen in some senses on like a micro level are harder to represent, for example, in international news, because they are not sort of the big story, right? But that is what makes up politics on an everyday level.
Yeah,
right?
and of course, at that time there was none of the kind of TV cable and the kind of computer news and so forth that you have today. So they were enacting laws at the same time that were restricting Palestinian rights and yet trying to get legitimacy internationally. I mean, even when they applied for the UN, they promised to live up to 194, which was the right of return, and at least take 100,000 Palestinians that they had chased out back in, and also to go back on the way in which they had altered West Jerusalem, since it was supposed to be an international city, and yet they reneged on it when they finally got accepted in the UN. Nobody did anything about it. But tell us, let's go on to the '67 war. Israel captures the rest of Palestine, and that is, of course, the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. What happened then in terms of relations between the Palestinians in Israel and the Palestinians in the occupied territories, especially in the West Bank?
Yeah, I wish I could have been there for some of those first years. They must have been so dramatic and transformative. So Palestinian citizens of Israel have been cut off from the rest of the Arab world because they couldn't travel to other parts of the Arab world. They also, as you mentioned, it was a completely different media landscape. So it was hard for them to even, read the newspapers coming from Arab countries, right? So all of a sudden now they could interact with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and in a certain sense beyond, because they were the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza could communicate more easily with the rest of the Arab world. So that was a real opening up. And also for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they finally could go back into other parts of historic Palestine. For many refugees who are in West Bank and Gaza, they could go back to their villages and cities and see their homes for the first time. They couldn't
actually go back and stay.
They couldn't stay, but they could visit, right? And I think that was probably a really transformative thing.
And how were the relations at this opening and later between the Palestinians and Israel? After all, they'd been separated for, almost 20 years. How were the relations between the two communities, those who are now under occupation and those who are in Israel?
I think that they're interesting and complex. There was a sense that Palestinian citizens of Israel had not done enough to resist Israeli rule, that they were, accommodating Israeli rule, and so there were some suspicions about Palestinian citizens of Israel, and in some ways those suspicions endure today. So there's some distrust.
Even today.
I think there's distrust.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that there is. I think it changes, but there is, right? And there are also not political structures that bridge these two groups in a really easy, straightforward way. There's no political party that both of them can easily participate in. The media that they read and listen to in some ways overlaps and is similar, but in some ways is quite different. So, I mean, they all might listen to Al Jazeera, for example, or to, various Arab satellite stations, but they don't have a single Palestinian news network that they can rely on that covers each of these places as though they're all part of one community, right? So the Palestinian Authority has its news outlets, but they primarily focus on the Palestinian Authority. I mean, at this point, obviously, they're even divided between the West Bank and Gaza, right?
Yes.
Let alone thinking about Palestinian citizens of Israel or Palestinian refugees. It's partly because the Palestinian Authority wants to legitimize its own authority and does so by then sort of cutting the West Bank off from, communities inside Israel.
They're still trying to talk about a two-state solution.
Exactly.
And so they don't want to appear to be, in a sense, trying to engage Palestinians in Israel. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's definitely that. And then it's also logistical. I mean, the logistics of having people working in, for example, inside Israel, in Lebanon, in Jordan, are not as easy as they would be in a normal situation, right?
Well, tell me how the Palestinian citizens of Israel reacted when the Israelis began in June, after the so-called alleged kidnapping and subsequent death of 3 Israeli youth settlers. And Israel blamed Hamas for it and subsequently found out Hamas was not involved. But they used that as an excuse to really assault the West Bank initially and ultimately, of course, to attack Gaza. How did the Palestinians in Israel, the citizens, react to what was happening in the West Bank, this assault, after these alleged kidnappings? Well,
in some ways, they were watching, I think, some of the same media, right? So Palestinians inside Israel will watch Israeli news. They need it to sort of follow the politics of Israeli, government and internal issues. But they're also actually watching Al Mayadeen, which is, I was actually trying to remember Al Mayadeen earlier when I said Al Jazeera, because actually Mayadeen was sort of the station everyone was watching this summer. They were watching it in the West Bank, and they were watching it inside Israel.
Mayadeen comes out of Beirut, and it's very progressive, and some former Al Jazeera people are involved in that too.
Yeah, there's a strong preference right now for that over Al Jazeera. They were skeptical about some of the primary elements of the narrative that Israel was telling about the kidnapping of the teenagers, and that was the same inside Israel and in the West Bank. And they were, I think, angry and afraid and frustrated by Israel's, vicious attack on Gaza.
Yeah. Well, tell us how they did react to the assault on Gaza, because it was never ending. It was just a constant, almost carpet bombing. What sorts of reactions did you see? Did they attempt to do anything?
There were various demonstrations and vigils in a lot of different cities and towns, Palestinian cities and towns. Sometimes they were with Israeli Jews, and sometimes they were really primarily Palestinian. The ones that were primarily Palestinian would also have some Jewish participation, but you could sort of characterize some as more Palestinian-oriented and some more Israeli-Jewish-oriented among these protests inside Israel. And I should say that it had already been a lively and difficult summer, really, because even before all of this happened, there was the hunger strike of the Palestinian political prisoners. And there had been a lot of solidarity with those prisoners, not only in the West Bank, but also inside Israel. So people were used to being out in the streets by the time the assault happened.
So there is a sense of being Palestinian and a kind of solidarity when these kinds of crises arise, and yet at the same time there is no unifying overall factor. Tell us about the social fragmentation of the Palestinian people, both in Israel and in the occupied territories?
Well, I went to Land Day commemoration actually in 2014 in March in a town called Qalansawa, which is in the Triangle.
Yeah, explain Land Day for our audience.
Land Day is an annual national commemoration of a series of protests in 1976 in which 7 Palestinians were killed by Israeli police because they were protesting a massive land confiscation that was going on in the Muthallath, in the Little Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
So every year Palestinians mark Land Day, and they do it inside Israel, they do it in the occupied territories, and I think throughout all Palestinian communities and refugee communities as well.
Yes, it's a major thing. So you were attending one of these annual gatherings.
Yeah.
Yes, and you were going to say something.
And I was going to say that there was this really interesting language about unity. One of the speakers was, we need to have unity, we need to strive, even though Israel tries to divide us, we must work very, very hard to stay unified between the Palestinians in the Galilee and in the Muthallath and in the Naqab. And that was actually where the sentence ended. So in other words, the fragmentation among Palestinian societies and communities is not just between Palestinians in, the West Bank and in Gaza.
But the fragmentation within the Palestinian community within Israel.
Yes. So and I should have backed up to say that there are 3 major population centers of Palestinians in Israel. The Galilee, which is still about 50% Palestinian and 50% Jewish. The Muthallath, which is a group of villages in the center of Israel that is in the shape of a triangle. The word Muthallath means triangle.
Referred often as a triangle.
And then in the Naqab, Bedouin Palestinians. And there are Palestinians who live in mixed cities, especially Haifa, and in Jaffa, and Ramle and Lid, and in Nazareth as well. Palestinian city, which now has a neighboring Israeli settlement next to it, Nazareth Elite, which is actually also becoming a mixed city. Palestinians live in Nazareth Elite also because they're pushed out. Their own Nazareth is getting too crowded for them to live in.
It's a major city.
So it was stunning to me that when unity was evoked, it was unfortunately unity among these 3 parts of Palestinian society within Israel, as though that itself is a challenge.
Yeah.
And they are politically different from each other, and I think that's why it was evoked. And they're geographically separate, and I think when communities are struggling just to get by, when socioeconomically Palestinian citizens of Israel are not doing as well, certainly, as Israeli Jews, when communities are struggling to get by, even sort of bridging those relatively small geographic differences is an issue.
And the Israelis have been, these segments of Israeli government have been really talking about trying to get rid of the Palestinian, or to lower the numbers of Palestinians in Israel. And so there's a lot of pressure on them in that way. But tell us, do these Palestinians in Israel ever relate to concepts of a Palestinian state, be it 2 states or 1 state?
I think that there's a diversity of opinion, of course, among Palestinian citizens of Israel about what Palestinian futures should look like. I think the support for a 1-state solution is probably proportionately, is growing and probably proportionally higher inside Israel, although I would really need to look up those statistics. So I really shouldn't speak too strongly about that. But many people think that 2-state solution will not serve Palestinian citizens of Israel, certainly not directly, because they will continue to be citizens of Israel, right?
That's right.
And even worse than that,
they won't have equality.
Right, they won't have equality, right? It will, in a sense, shore up Israel's claim that Israel can be a Jewish state and can marginalize the non-Jewish population.
And
right?
there may be an effort to find ways to transfer them to so-called a Palestinian state, if it ever occurred, which most people don't think it will.
Right.
Tell us now about David Brooks' episode. You have written on backstories in media and how Palestinian policies and whatnot are portrayed. So you understand media and how it's used and abused. David Brooks, of course, is a New York Times opinion page writer of significant impact. And so tell us about the recent thing that came out about his son and in the Gaza war.
Right. So in September, David Brooks gave an interview to the Haaretz, I believe, weekly magazine in Hebrew. I mean, I don't think he gave it in Hebrew, but it was published in Hebrew. And in it, a few like sort of new information about David Brooks came out. First of all, he said that his son was serving in the military, in the Israeli military. And also that he said that he had been traveling to Israel almost every year since 1991. This was then covered in the American Jewish press and then by sort of the Israeli-Palestinian blogosphere in general. And various parts like Mondo Weiss and Alison Weir and other people immediately criticized Brooks for not having disclosed this fact, that his son was serving in the Israeli military.
And his writings have been very partial to Israel.
Certainly.
He is very devoted to the country. So this is a new factor. So what resulted? How did he respond to that?
I don't think that he has responded. I've been watching, and I don't think that he's responded. His paper responded. The public editor of the New York Times wrote a column saying that David Brooks should make a one-time acknowledgement that his son is in the Israeli army, but that he shouldn't recuse himself from writing about the conflict. And interestingly, the editor of the op-ed page said, I don't think that it really makes any difference that David Brooks' son is serving in the military. I'm sure many factors influence how he sees this conflict, and he's a smart man and he can sort of make his own decisions. And I will say that to a certain extent, I perhaps agree with that editor, because it doesn't necessarily seem to me that perhaps having a son in the military is anything.
Doesn't add.
It doesn't add.
He's already been very pro-Israeli, almost a knee-jerk pro-Israeli.
Exactly. I mean, honestly, if he's been traveling to Israel, almost every year since 1991, that's an extraordinary commitment to Israel, right? And so I actually can kind of imagine that having his son in the army may not particularly change his.
Well, Ethan Brana, also of the New York Times, had his son was in the Israeli army as well. But,
and he was a foreign correspondent, obviously, and so that made it, in a sense, a different sort of set of questions, right? Because he's supposed to be covering Israeli society and Palestinian society for an American audience with something like impartiality, right? So he had this very, very strong connection, obviously, to Israel. And again, the public editor suggests that he should be transferred and work elsewhere. And the executive editor said, I think that that Ethan Bronner has sort of the wherewithal to stand apart from his situation and report objectively, despite this.
Well, one wonders if you had an American of, say, Palestinian background in government, American government, and his son were fighting with Hamas or something, there would be a huge uproar,
right,
over that.
Right.
But in any
I mean,
case,
this is service in a foreign army, right,
Yeah,
that we're talking about, and it makes a big difference. I mean, for me, what I think is David Brooks is, on the op-ed pages. I'm not necessarily sure that he should, stop being on the op-ed pages or stop writing about Israel. What I would like to see is for the New York Times to invite somebody of Arab or Muslim descent to be a regular columnist for the paper. And I don't mean that that person would sort of represent our incredibly diverse Arab and Muslim American community, but that person would add to the conversation in the mix. And I think it would be extraordinary if that person had, for example, direct experience of living under military occupation.
That would be, of course. I don't think we're going to see that.
But I think
it would certainly be interesting, and to give that person the same rights that they give to David Brooks, and assume that they are credible and can act objectively.
I mean, to me, this wouldn't just help our coverage or the New York Times coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think if a person had an on-the-ground experience of what military occupation is like, Israeli military occupation, that would also inform how they look at other American occupations in the Middle East, right, and post-occupation situations, right, other American military presences in the Middle East. Yeah.
It would make a whole big difference in terms of how they view the Middle East. Let's go back to the citizens, and you've been doing a lot of research on them and some of their connections to especially West Bank people and enterprises they may be undertaking. Tell us more about the research you're doing and what your findings have been thus far.
So I have been doing research on the relationship between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank. And it's ethnographic research, which means I want to sort of be at sites of interaction as much as I can. And the difficult thing, of course, is that there are not that many sites of interaction, right? So in part, the project has become a bit comparative, and in part, there are moments of connection that I examine. So I've been going to, for example, Land Day commemorations and commemorations of the Palestinian Nakba in both communities. The Nakba is, of course...
Yes. And then the Naksa and the Nakba. The Naksa is the 67 war, the Nakba is 48 dispersal people. I remember we interviewed you when you first started, looking at some of these connections now. Well, once the 67 war occurred, there was more movement, and people from the occupied territories were able to get permits to work in Israel and to visit their homes, and Palestinians from Israel could visit. That, of course, has ceased, and you have to get special permits to go in either direction. At that time that we interviewed you, I believe you were talking about some attempts at common enterprises or efforts. Have these ceased? Did Oslo have a chilling effect on communication between these peoples?
Well, I think Oslo, it made Palestinian citizens of Israel feel less represented by the center of the Palestinian nationalist movement. The PLO tried to represent Palestinians everywhere. Right? I mean, and it didn't do so perfectly, right? And representing Palestinians in Israel was especially hard because for decades the PLO was regarded as a terrorist organization by Israel, and any connections to the PLO could land a Palestinian citizen of Israel in prison. So it was very dangerous to be connected to the PLO, but the PLO tried to represent all Palestinians. Palestinian Authority, of course, has in many ways usurped the role of the PLO on the world stage. It's now seen as the primary representative of Palestinians on the world stage, and it can make no claims to represent Palestinians in any other places other than the West Bank and Gaza.
This is, I mean, even though Abbas at his recent talk in the UN talked about representing the, that the PLO still represents the diaspora and Palestinians on the soil. It's just not true. I mean, basically it is the people in the occupied territories.
Of course, he's been playing a game there where he is the head of both the PA and the PLO, right? So, I mean, on top of the fact that a decision has been made to recenter Palestinian politics only around the West Bank and Gaza, we have, terrible problems of governance and democracy, obviously, in the Palestinian leadership as well, or lack of democracy, right?
So are there any other connections other than these celebrations of common holidays? I mean, is there anything going on? Do they publish together? Do they have any kind of enterprises together, the citizens and those under occupation?
They do from time to time. I mean, first of all, they don't go to these Land Day and Nakba Day commemorations together because they basically can't, right? Everybody has them in their own community. So I've been going to sort of celebrations and commemorations, not celebrations of those events, but commemorations in both communities. There's certain media enterprises that try to cross the green line. Actually, a lot of Palestinian citizens of Israel are now going to universities in the West Bank.
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
And they're allowed to do that?
They are, yeah. So Palestinian citizens of Israel can go to the West Bank. They do see, basically when you enter parts of the West Bank that are under full Palestinian Authority control, you see a big red sign, and it says that you are now entering Palestinian Authority-controlled areas. Entrance to Israeli citizens is prohibited and dangerous to your life. There's actually a third thing. It's prohibited, something, something, and dangerous to your life, right? And it's written in 3 languages. But there's nobody to stop you, really. So Palestinian citizens of Israel can go to the West Bank on a practical level, although it is illegal. And so they've been going to some of these universities because they offer good programs in fields that Palestinians are interested in pursuing.
They can't get in Israeli universities.
Yes.
So there are no other real, I mean, there are no real projects that can take place between these two communities.
I think there are, but they are very spread out. They're diffuse and they're often sort of one-off projects. There are conversations going on, right? And, I think some Palestinian NGOs inside Israel have been trying to expand their work to look more at the occupied territories. Adala is one organization that's been doing more and more to work across the Green Line and to exhibit the similarities that Palestinians face in both inside Israel and in the occupied territories, for example.
Is there awareness in the occupied territories that Palestinian citizens of Israel actually face the same kinds of, that there's great discrimination against them?
I think,
and that they have the same problems of movement and where they can live within Israel and so forth. Is there any awareness of that?
I think there's some awareness, but it's not as fine-grained as one would wish it would be.
If you were to describe the situation for Palestinian citizens as compared to Palestinians under occupation, there are many similarities, but there are some differences. How would you describe these two communities? I mean, there are really more communities because you look at the fragmentation, and we'll talk a little bit more later about the fragmentation in the occupied territories. But how would you describe them?
Well, I was talking to a man whose home is threatened with demolition in the Triangle, actually in Kalansawa, the town that I was mentioning earlier. And he said, I was talking to my friend from the West Bank, and I said, you actually have it easier than we do. And the friend from the West Bank said, what do you mean? That's such a shocking thing you would say that. And he said, listen, they shoot you and they kill you and you become a martyr. Us, they don't kill us outright. They destroy our homes, they throw us in prison, in the zinzana, in the solitary confinement cell, and they give us a life sentence, right? You, they kill with the bullet and you become a martyr. We, they kill us with the pen, with the law. And I thought that was a really interesting way of saying it.
That's very fascinating. I mean, the citizens, theoretically, they live better, I mean, physically.
Right.
But at the same time, I mean, I remember a book written by Majid Shahade on two communities in a soccer game, in which he talked about one community being Druze and one community being Christian, and there was a conflagration over the soccer game, and the Israelis didn't come to stop any of the outbursts, and they really were stimulating these two communities getting furious, and they didn't allow the usual traditional way of solving the problem, which is to have the elders gather and so forth. And so that there is a constant pressure on citizens in Israel also to divide and rule them, and to also seek, right from the beginning, they sought to have a body of collaborators. Is that still going on? I mean, are there people who are considered to be collaborators in Israel against the Palestinian population?
Yes. I think probably it takes different forms in different places, but absolutely. And certainly the network of collaborators is very, very effective in the West Bank as well.
Yes.
Absolutely crucial to the way Israel is able to operate, right?
Yes, and they have records on everything, and they have people. How do they get these people to be collaborators? I mean, aside from trying to, in the early days they bribed, some of them gave them perks.
Right.
Other ways they threatened their families.
I mean, I actually know more probably about that process in the West Bank than inside Israel, but I think that, they arrest people very young and they threaten them, and they threaten their families, and they can promise a young person that he'll get a lighter sentence if he'll just give a little bit of information, things like this.
You are watching an interview with Professor Amahl Bishara discussing the divisions of the Palestinian community and the issues affecting the residents within. Please stay tuned. We'll be back with more after this short break.
You are watching the Arabic Hour a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
How would you summarize some of the work that you're doing, and what are the goals that you hope to reach in your research?
So this summer, actually, I did something that was really fun and interesting, I believe. I worked with a group of young photographers in Aida Refugee Camp, and a group of, which is in Bethlehem in the West Bank,
right.
and a group of photographers in Jaffa.
Which is of course the coastline of Israel, which was supposed to be part of a partitioned part of an Arab state. So go ahead.
So these two groups of people were taking pictures of their communities and sharing these pictures with each other, and we were looking for similarities and differences, and just looking to start a conversation about these two communities and the challenges that they face. It was a really difficult time to do it because of the war. Everyone was really under extraordinary pressure, but it was a good attempt at, I think, starting this conversation through this mode of photography, right? I mean, obviously this conversation happens in other ways, but this was one attempt to try this out. And at the end of the summer, we actually had an exhibition. And the exhibition was in Jaffa and in Bethlehem. And, you know, it was an exciting time to see these things come together and to see the work that we'd produced together about issues that we all cared about, right? So it was interesting to see Palestinians in both communities taking pictures, for example, of kids, right? And each because, you know, children are sort of at the heart, I think, of Palestinian society in so many ways. And thinking about concepts of home and ideas about being safe. And both communities were taking pictures of protests that had happened around Gaza. So you did see sort of those fundamental similarities and concerns that Palestinians in both of those two communities had. And
they were similar, as far
those were similar, yeah. But I mean, I think that we saw a lot of differences as well, and the project itself was very difficult to undertake because, you know, Palestinians from the West Bank couldn't go to Jaffa at all, and the Palestinians from Jaffa, it was difficult to welcome them to the West Bank because the political situation was so tense that they really felt that they were crossing very difficult lines to come to Aida Refugee Camp. We had one meeting, and there had been some concerns that, you know, they shouldn't come at all because the security situation was so tense.
A war was going on, and the Israeli army had already sort of blasted and put a lot of people in prison on the West Bank.
Yeah, and it was before the actual war started, this particular meeting. But so they arrived, and we were sitting in Laje Center, which is where we were holding our meeting, and all of a sudden there were these explosions going on outside. And the person who was talking was from Aida Refugee Camp, and he basically just kept talking. He might have kind of glanced at the window, but he really just kept talking, and we went on like this for a little bit until there were a few people in the room that were kind of like laughing a little bit, right? And somebody said, okay, let's stop and let's explain what's going on outside our windows here, right? You know, the army has just come in from the military base. It's about 100 meters from here. Those sounds are, you know, sound grenades, and, you know, I can't remember if there were bullets at that moment or not, rubber bullets or steel-coated or rubber-coated steel bullets, and, you know, tear gas and all of these things, right? You know, so let me explain what's going on here. This is totally normal. You're actually safe in this room. Let's just close the windows so no tear gas gets in. And the meeting continued. But I mean, that is not a normal way to welcome people, obviously. And it's also not an easy way to have a dialogue. People didn't feel safe on so many different levels.
Tell me, some of these same citizens, how did they feel when they were in Israel and these rockets that practically did no damage were coming from Gaza? Did they also feel scared? Because, I mean, these rockets are coming, even though they hardly hit anything. How did they feel about that? Were they angry at Gazans?
No, I don't think they were definitely not angry at Gazans or at the people, you know, Hamas or other, you know, others flying rockets.
Were they scared?
I think it kind of depended, I think, on one's personality and one's sort of maybe exact location. I think they were anxious, but I think their anxieties came not just from concerns about the rockets, but also the fact that Israeli society, Jewish elements of Israeli society were becoming
angry at them.
Yeah, exactly. There was so much tension between Jews and Palestinians within Israel during that time. People were worried about losing their jobs. People were worried about street violence. So it was an extraordinarily tense situation. I think it's, the rockets were a strange thing because, as you said, they did not hurt many people at all.
But 2 or 3 who died.
Obviously, it's not completely comfortable, perhaps, right, for some people to see those rockets.
Of course, rockets are coming,
right.
And you don't know if they're going to hit any place or not.
Yeah, but the much bigger tension, I think, was, and the much more immediate danger was of, violence against especially Palestinian young men inside Israel, and again, like jobs and things like this.
I recall when the Khomeini revolution occurred in Iran, the Iranian students in this country were scared to death. And of course, they were investigated by the FBI, and some of them were deported if they were pro-Khomeini. And many of them were so frightened from the general public that they began to call themselves Arabs or Persians, assuming that Americans didn't know what Persians were. So they settled on Persians. At first they started to say, well, they're really Arab. And then they figured that wasn't such a good idea either.
Right.
So this happens, already they are unwanted.
Right.
Already there is discrimination against them.
And they're seen as the enemy.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so even though things may have quieted, this kind of feeling once raised, built on a foundation of not wanting Palestinians, becomes sustained. And I'm sure that that population is continuing to feel insecure. Are many of them trying to migrate? Can they migrate?
I don't think that there's a high percentage of people who are trying to leave. I think, in many cases they think that their presence is very important for sort of staking their own claim.
They understood what happened in the Nakba, and they don't want to lose their rights.
Exactly.
To their homes and so on. Tell us about the Aida Research Institute, which does work on Palestinians in Israel. And that started something like, 5 or 10 years ago. And it has been doing research on this community. Are they publishing reports now, and are they continuing to work? Have they managed to find any increase in problems?
I think that this is an incredibly important initiative. So Palestinian citizens of Israel, we talked about how they were really utterly cut off from the Arab world from 1948 to 1967. Yes. But they continue to be, in many ways, cut off from the Arab world. They don't have their own institutions as much as, for example, Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza do, right? Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, not only do they have, a history of Palestinian civil society, they have the Palestinian Authority, they have donors, international donors willing to fund all kinds of initiatives, right? For Palestinians in Israel, it's not the case. So Aida is a really important research institution that allows Palestinian citizens of Israel to have a place to, have research that's funded by, and shared among Palestinians, a place to present their work in Arabic and to, to discuss, their work in Arabic. So it's just absolutely critical.
What are some of the topics that they cover?
They've been covering memories of Nakba, women's experiences. They have publications related to sort of the concept of settler colonialism as it relates to Israel. They document, violence against Palestinian citizens of Israel. So they really cover a wide variety of issues.
How does Israel react to that institute and to its publications?
I think that there's been attempts to marginalize and defund or delegitimize even progressive Jewish organizations within Israel. And the pressure is even more intense on Palestinian organizations.
There was a Canadian organization that used to give funding to that research institute, and then a great deal of pressure was put on them, I assume by Zionists, and they stopped putting up funds. So is MATA continuing to get sufficient funding?
It's I mean, as it is for most, smaller NGOs, it's an ongoing struggle. But I think that MATA is rising to the occasion.
So this is, in a sense, not an institution of unity, but it is a Palestinian institution.
It is.
And then there is Adala, right? And tell me about Adala and what it is doing now.
Adala is a really important organization, legal advocacy organization. Started off focusing primarily or exclusively, I believe, on Palestinian citizens of Israel and the legal challenges that they face. But starting around 2002, they started to take on cases related to the occupied territories. And I think now some of their work, anyway, wants to think about the relationship between these two locations. So they've made a fantastic documentary, which is really relevant for all that we've been talking about. It's called From Araqib to Susia. And it is a documentary that compares the situation of Palestinians in the Negev, in Naqab, in a village called Araqib, with Palestinians in the Hebron Hills in the West Bank. These two communities are under severe threat for their very existence.
One being in Israel, one being in the occupied territory.
Yeah, and they experience similar problems. So Adala is doing that fantastic work. They also have a database of discriminatory laws. And in fact, I meant to mention this earlier in the conversation, they have a database of discriminatory laws, and Israel has over 50 laws that discriminate against its Palestinian citizens. So Adala is doing really, really, really important work.
Well, they also have an office in New York. So tell us a little bit about the settlement map and how this has fragmented geographically the area. I mean, the area A, B, and C we've discussed on this program before. Under Oslo, split up the West Bank, and then in addition, you have the wall, and now in settlements. So tell us what that really means for the West Bank. It's progressively fragmented geographically, and I assume because they can't communicate, it fragments them socially more.
Yes. I mean, settler presence, not only does it fragment the West Bank geographically, but it makes the West Bank much, much, much more violent. I'm sure you heard just this last week, two 5-year-old girls were walking home from school.
Yes.
Holding hands, walking home from kindergarten, and they were hit by a settler who was driving by, and he didn't stop and he didn't call anyone. He waited until he got home to call anybody, and these girls, one of them was killed. Her name is Inas, and her friend was in critical condition, but I think is making it, it's going to be okay, it's going to recover. Settlers operate outside the law when it comes to their relationship to Palestinians. The law exists, Israeli law and military law exists to protect settlers, obviously at the expense of Palestinians. There was a really important piece on, I believe, 972 magazine. It might have been Manda Weiss.
Which is an Israeli progressive magazine, basically.
By somebody who was writing under the pseudonym John Brown, I believe. So he compared the way in which this settler was getting away with murder, killing this 5-year-old girl with his car, to a Palestinian man who I believe was in his mid-30s. He had been coming home from work. Sorry, just a minute. Right, so this article by John Brown, written under the pseudonym John Brown, compared the case of the 5-year-old girl who was killed by a settler, a Palestinian girl killed by a Jewish settler, and the settler went home and continued with his affairs as though nothing had happened, with a Palestinian man who was in his mid-30s. He was driving, I think, home from work, and he accidentally injured a Jewish settler, a woman. He then drove himself and turned himself in at a military outpost, and he ended up dying in prison because of abuses in prison. So this is
the difference between a conscience and a non-conscience.
It's also the difference, yeah, right. I mean, it's the difference between certain people being completely above the law and others being utterly subject to its whims and to its forms of violence, right?
We're coming to a close of our program, which has been very interesting, but how would you project or see what the future looked like for Palestinians, both in Israel and in the occupied territories? What do you see ahead? Is there any ray of hope, or is there, continuing status quo with pockets of resistance?
I mean, I think in the short term, I think we're probably looking at the status quo with pockets of resistance. The larger political structures are just not lending themselves towards organized, coordinated, moving forward towards collective justice. And towards a real peace. So
there is the other end where the Israeli institutions and society itself is beginning to come under critique from the international community. So does the possibility of a resurgence of Palestinian unity and the disintegration, not totally, but I mean the attacks that Israel's experiencing, kind of coordinate in a way to bring about some new effort to solve this problem?
I hope so. And the energy behind BDS is an interesting thing because it connects Palestinian energies in Palestine with solidarity, activism all around the world.
And that is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So hopefully, I actually teach this book about the end of the Soviet Union, and it's called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. And it's about a political system changing dramatically. And I think that obviously there's really no comparison between the Soviet Union and Israel.
But things do change.
Things can change.
And things do come to an end.
Yeah, and you know what I think? I think, we can work towards changing situations so that everybody will be able to live with more security and peace and justice. That's important for us to do that work towards change. It's also important to sort of, to take care of people and communities in the meantime.
Yes. Well, we thank you for being on Arabic Hour. As usual, it was very enlightening.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Hope you come back again.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You just saw an interview with Palestinian activist Professor Amahl Bishara. Please stay tuned. We'll be back with more after this short break.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.